So I'd like to welcome you today to presentation by Rebecca. Oh, let me try this. Yep, Rebecca Summerhays. So Rebecca, we're very happy. It's wonderful to have had Rebecca here as a Newhouse Summer Faculty Fellow this past year. So Rebecca came to us from Brown University, where she did a PhD in English literature. And her PhD was on, let me check my notes, embodiment, the concept of embodiment, in Victorian literature and science. And Rebecca came to us via Harvard, where she taught for a number of years before coming to Wellesley. As a summer faculty fellow, she worked on two pieces here. One on Frankenstein, which she will share with us today, and the other project explores how Charlotte Bronte seized on early 19th century theories of the brain and the nerves to represent character in Jane Eyre. And I'm going to give you a little taste of the spring. On April 7th, 2020, we're going to have a faculty panel, and it's called Brainstorming, and it will include, I think Annie is included, and Rebecca and Julie Walsh from philosophy, and then some other faculty are going to be participating. And at that event, Rebecca will tell us a little bit about the Jane Eyre project, correct? Okay. I've also learned in Rebecca's teaching life, she has taken a truly creative approach to teaching writing at Wellesley. She has one course that's related to her research. She has another course that I would like to take called The Successful Life. All students do projects that interrogate the idea of success. It's great. And then she also teaches a course on arts, crafts, and protest. And I happened to have a word with one of Rebecca's former students who took this class when she was a first-year student. And what was reported to me was that Rebecca taught students how women's crafts have been used to promote social justice, and not satisfied with just teaching through conversation and discussion, Rebecca actually taught the students how to crochet a blanket, which they then sent to the border to keep human beings warm. So with that introduction, Rebecca, welcome. Welcome to your space.
So first of all, thank you to Eve Zimmerman. Thank you also to Lauren Cote and my fellow Newhouse Fellows. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to learn from you over the past few months. I can't overstate how grateful I am for the support with this project. And to the audience, thank you for coming. It's an honor to see my friends here. It's an honor to see students here, colleagues, and people I don't know. That's also exciting. So thank you for coming out on this dreary night of November to quote one of Shelley's most famous passages. So let's start with Frankenstein. Contemporary representations of Victor Frankenstein's creation, both popular and scholarly, refuse to see the creature whole. That is, in both film and in literary scholarship, he is either a hideous body or a beautiful mind, but rarely both. For instance, if its afterlife in film has ensured Mary Shelley's 1818 novel a place in the 19th century canon, its treatment in film and also on t-shirts has also ensured that popular culture misremembers Frankenstein principally as a horror story that narrates the unholy creation of a gruesome body, grunting, inarticulate, massive, on a famously dark and stormy night. Of course, the novel supports this interpretation in part, but in playing up the most sensational elements of Shelley's story, film versions of the novel tend to neglect one of the monster's defining traits, his extraordinary intellect. In contrast, decades of literary scholarship have so successfully shifted the focus away from the creature's body to his finer qualities, his eloquence, his moral consciousness, his intellect, that if contemporary readers now misremember the novel, they mistake it for a sentimental journey and the monster for a man of feeling. Scholarship consistently glosses over the monster's body simply as a marker of otherness, and insists upon the creature's eloquence, education, and depth of feeling as the markers of a selfhood unjustly denied him. Of course, Shelley's text partly supports this reading too. The creature speaks extremely well. Without exception, he persuades every character who hears his voice that he is an individual worthy of the same companionship that the novel's other characters crave. Even Victor Frankenstein, sworn to track and kill his own creation, finds that he compassionates the creature and feels a wish to console him when the monster describes his intense loneliness. However, despite the profound sorrow and matchless intelligence that criticism has noted, the creature simply does not partake of the same kind of humanity that the other characters possess. By overemphasizing the creature's consciousness to the exclusion of his embodiment, criticism of the novel remains blind to what popular representations of the creature refuse to forget. The creature's intellect arises from a specific kind of body that, I argue, became imaginable for the first time in the early 19th century, as Britain coughed and sputtered through the start of the Industrial Revolution. The creature's emotionality springs from the mechanical processes of a body constructed from interchangeable parts, cobbled together according to machine principles and set in motion by its maker, endowed with extraordinary strength that is more mechanical than human. The monster, I argue, embodies the grim truth of human life in the mechanical age. To survive industrialization, humans had to become like the monster, more machine than human, physically and psychically bound by what Shelley describes as mechanical impulse to other workers and the machines they operated. In this regard, Shelley's Creature places the novel form itself on the defensive, as a literary form that is wholly unprepared for the machine life that Shelley, by creating the creature, brings to the house of fiction. Nicholas Dames theorizes that the Victorian novel was a training ground for industrialized consciousness, not a refuge from it. I argue that this training began decades earlier in the century with Shelley's Creature, who confronted readers with the biomechanical life that had become imaginable for the first time, threatening all that the early 19th century thought that it knew about humans, machines, and the novel form. So to make this argument, I read Frankenstein as a critical response to William Paley's enormously influential and largely forgotten today natural theology, and place both against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. So what is a natural theology? Natural theologies, including Paley's, were early intelligent design arguments that were popular in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Natural theologians, including John Ray, William Durham, Gilbert White, and Paley himself, were country clergymen who studied the natural world around them and wrote about their observations. In their writing, natural theologians claimed that the structural complexity of the natural world proves that an omniscient God personally designed and created each species by hand. Paley's natural theology comes at the tail end of this tradition. It reached the height of its popularity in the early 19th century, at the precise time when Shelley wrote and published Frankenstein. I find it remarkable for its attempt to celebrate machinery by requiring readers to revere all bodies, including their own, as miniature versions of the factories, mills, and refineries springing up around Britain. Paley's most striking arguments situate all living beings, including humans, within a vast biomechanical landscape and imply that the conceptual difference between bodies and machines is a matter of degree rather than kind. For Paley, the continuity between bodies and machines is nothing less than holy, evidence of God's care for his creation. So what does Shelley have to say back to Paley? By animating her monster, an amalgamation of dead, lifeless parts, with an intelligence that rivals his creator's, Shelley gives literary form to the human as Paley imagines it. By introducing her monster's body into her novel, Shelley tests whether pre-industrial novelistic forms can withstand Paley's vision of mechanical life. The Creature disfigures the novel of education and destroys the form of domestic fiction. As two novelistic forms invested in specifically pre-industrial subjects, these traditional forms cannot contain the contradiction that the human became in the early 19th century. The question then is, what kind of novel arises instead? So in this talk, I'm going to spend a bit of time providing some background on Paley, some context on Paley, looking at a few of his most important passages, or what I consider his most important passages, and then for the remainder of the talk, I'll go to Frankenstein. So, Paley's sources. Paley was by no means the first writer to theorize about the connection between humans and machines. From the Renaissance to the present, it has proven difficult, if not impossible, to theorize the human body and human consciousness without also wrestling with the machine. From the early modern period to the early 19th century, artists and authors alike drew upon engines, microscopic lenses, the camera obscura, calculating machines, pipes, stringed instruments, eyeglasses, and other simple machines in an attempt to describe and explain the human body, how it feels, and how it thinks. So why then think about Paley, since he writes at the end and not at the start of a tradition of use the machine to understand the body? The first reason has to do with the unique context in which Paley wrote. Paley's predecessors wrote before the Industrial Revolution. Historical circumstances did not require any of these writers to promote a mechanical vision of nature for a readership sensitive to the threats that the factory system posed. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, many rightly feared that the factory system would convert workers into machines themselves, transforming the working class into a single mechanical mass. Both Tory and radical groups rightly predicted that the factory system would obliterate modes of production that depended upon skilled craftsmen, leaving those laborers without work. Paley's text is remarkable because these factories provided Paley with a new vocabulary for describing the human body. His metaphors ask readers to compare their bodies to the industrial factories springing up all around them. His predecessors, in contrast, simply compared the human body to the simple machines of everyday life. A second reason to study Paley has to do with his popularity and his influence. From its 1802 publication to the present, Paley's Natural Theology is certainly not without its critics. Nevertheless, it was an influential text at the particular moment when Shelley was writing. It ran through 20 editions before 1820, remained in print for over 100 years, and reigned as the dominant account of the natural world before Darwin's origin. Darwin himself studied natural theology at Cambridge and acknowledged that it shaped his thinking. In his autobiography, he writes that his study of Paley was the only part of the academical course which, as I then felt and as I still believe, was the most use to me in the education of my mind. Natural theology surged in popularity when Shelley was writing Frankenstein. Her readers were likely his readers too. Seizing upon the new vocabulary of the factory, Paley transforms all living bodies into intricate systems of ducts, pipes, spikes, knobs, tubes, joints, and conduits. His countless analogies rhetorically transform the digestive system, for example, into a cider mill, the bird's gullet into a corn mill, the spine into an iron bridge. These analogies nudge readers toward the proposition that an animal is a machine, that there is mechanism in animals, that this mechanism is as properly such as it is in machines made by art, that whenever it is intelligible and certain, it demonstrates intention and contrivance, as well in the works of nature as in those of art. In this passage, Paley is not interested in convincing his readers that machines simply mimic nature. Instead, he places nature in a secondary relationship to the machine, arguing that the works of nature resemble machines made by art. As mechanically complex objects, both bodies and machines display the artistry and the labor that produced them. By emphasizing the artistry that he assumes must govern the production of both factories and bodies, Paley's rhetoric ingeniously consecrates machinery. That is, his language insists that the mills and distilleries that our bodies resemble do not threaten human artistry, but instead make it visible. As Neil Gillespie has claimed, it was as if in baptizing mechanism, Paley was attempting to reassure the English public that industrialization could properly be part of the divine order of the world. Paley's relentless fascination with mechanical fit, no matter how small, idealizes a single biomechanical world where, quote, one part answers to another part and every part to the final result. For Paley, the natural world is a mysterious network of corresponding parts that answer one another. Only a master craftsman, he argues, could produce such a design. To support this argument, Paley catalogs instance after instance of what he calls relation, the perfect fit between nature's component parts. Like the cogs of a machine, the disparate parts of our bodies appear to have been designed specifically with the other parts in mind. In Paley's vision, each part of nature is made for and bound to another in relays that Deleuze and Guattari would call an assemblage. Together, that is, the hummingbird and the flower, or a colony of bees, form a single organism that is more than the sum of its component parts. So where are humans within this landscape? We would expect a theologian to insist on humanity's exceptional status as God's highest creation. But surprisingly, Paley's argument erodes the barrier between man and animal, not to mention the boundaries separating biological life from the industrial landscape. At every turn, Paley asks his readers to contemplate the many mechanical similarities we share with both animals and with machines. In his words, "We prize but little what we share only in common with the rest, or with the generality of our species. The common benefits of our nature entirely escape us. Yet these are the great things. It is in those things which are so common as to be no distinction that the amplitude of the divine benignity is perceived." When readers contemplate the mechanisms that all share, the presumed differences between human, animal, and mechanical bodies fall away. The industrial and the natural worlds merge into a single factory system that includes human bodies. Despite his best efforts to reconcile the organic and the mechanistic, Paley's machine itself breaks down when he examines it too closely. Paley's most fascinating passages are those in which Paley must confront the monstrosity that haunts the periphery of this perfectly wrought biomechanical world. Unlike the machines that he celebrates, bodies will wear out from constant work. In passages like the following, where Paley describes a mother bird sitting on her nest, Paley betrays at least a passing awareness that bodies are not always fit for the work that nature requires, and they are certainly not fit for the relentless work required by the new machine economy. He says, "Neither ought it, under this head, to be forgotten how much the instinct costs the animal which feels it, how much a bird gives up by sitting upon her nest, how repugnant it is to her organization, her habits, and her pleasures. What is more, an animal delighting in motion is for many hours of many days together fixed to her nest, as close as if her limbs were tied down by pins and wires. But the loss of that liberty is not the whole of what that procreant bird suffers. Harvey tells us that he has often found the female wasted to skin and bone by sitting upon her eggs." Paley undoubtedly intends to demonstrate here the astonishing power of instinct with this example. But in this critical moment, his focus on the individual mother bird reveals that nature is hardly the benevolent, perfectly integrated factory system he imagines, and that factories themselves are hardly the works of art that he imagines. The mother bird confronts Paley with the limits of his own examples. By using the factory system to theorize the body, Paley's analogies make the body into something it simply isn't, a mechanical object that will never wear out. In instances like this one, a close look at nature's machine exposes the high cost that labor always exacts on bodies. In this instance, the individual bird's purpose entirely consumes her. She lives without self-concern or the power to act independently of her work. She accordingly, quote, wastes upon her eggs, as if transfixed by the pins and wires reinforcing nature's great factory. The demands of her work alienate her from her own body, which remains a secret she is not let into. In this context, the imperative to work does not allow the individual to thrive. Labor comes at the expense of life. Her form, wasted to skin and bone, reminds both Paley and readers that factory labor will likewise waste healthy human bodies. To protect his argument that the natural world is a coherent, well-oiled machine, Paley stops looking too closely. Instead, he assumes a godlike perspective over the natural world that values the whole more than its component parts. As he writes, "For my part, I never see a bird in that situation, but I recognize an invisible hand detaining the contented prisoner from her fields and groves, for a purpose, as the event proves, the most worthy of the sacrifice, the most important, the most beneficial. By evoking the invisible hand that stands for economic agency in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, Paley renders the mother bird's wasting body practically inconsequential, especially compared to the most beneficial purpose her labor serves. By so doing, he implies that when human bodies wear themselves out in work, their work, too, serves a larger purpose. Struggling to preserve his own economic interest, Adam Smith's man unwittingly serves the group. Like that economic man, the mother bird serves a worthy, beneficial, important purpose larger than herself. Her labor ensures the survival of her species." Paley thus shuttles between radically opposed points of view to hold together his precarious vision of nature. The majority of natural theology reads like an inventory, as Paley catalogs every last detail of biomechanical life that implies design. Whenever the machine of nature threatens to consume the individual, however, Paley trades the wonder that details inspire for an omniscient point of view of the whole. The sum of nature's health and happiness absorbs and neutralizes individual pain, including the mother bird's body. Paley's bird's-eye perspective ensures that God remains a benevolent creator, machines remain works of art, and readers conclude, even in the face of immense suffering, that the biomechanical world, quote, is a happy world after all. As natural theology's author, the position Paley assumes relative to the world he describes is analogous to God's omniscient view over creation. By fostering in his readers a feel for the grand design of biomechanical life, and by admonishing readers to imbibe its influence, Paley invites his readers to assume a position of superiority close to the one that he reserves for himself. Thus, it is fair to say, where in terms of biology, he insists that all parts, including humans, are interrelated. In terms of creative intelligence, Paley refuses to abandon the human to the instincts that pinned the mother bird to her nest. Paley thus suspends his readers between biomechanical and rational life. We are at once part of the machine, and at the same time we're separate from it, capable of studying it and mastering it. As such, as Shelley will show, we incorporate a monstrous contradiction. By assembling her monster, Shelley gives literary form to this contradiction. By placing this monster within a traditional novel of education, Shelley shows how absolutely unprepared these traditional novels are for Paley's vision of mechanical life. To understand this point, I want to next briefly consider what those pre-industrial novels looked like, what they aimed to accomplish, before turning in the last section of my talk to Shelley's novel. So, what is a Bildungsroman? Simply put, a Bildungsroman is a novel of education. These kinds of novels became popular in the 18th century. Voltaire's Candide, Fielding's Tom Jones, Goethe's novels would be some examples. And they remain popular today. Most notably, Harry Potter, I would say, counts as a Bildungsroman. Essentially, these novels narrate two complementary processes: the self-education of an individual, usually male, against seemingly impossible odds, and the social integration of that self, often through marriage, into a community of individuals that are like him. By so doing, these novels detach human value from wealth and reassign value to what George Levine calls a deeply personal, private, highly interiorized individuality. A character achieves this kind of individuality through a series of plot twists that require him to act autonomously, to reflect upon antagonistic circumstances, to learn from his mistakes, and successfully to determine his own course. By narrating the gradual self-fashioning of an individual, the Bildungsroman shapes the reader into a similarly reflective, autonomous self and performs what D.A. Miller defines as the novel's central purpose, to, quote, confirm the novel reader in his identity as a liberal subject. According to Franco Moretti, the modern world requires individuals to experience themselves in contradictory ways, as both autonomous subjects and as social beings who must live alongside other individuals. Moretti famously names the Bildungsroman the symbolic form of modernity because it reconciles these competing demands of being a self, but also existing within a community. Given its interest in accommodating selves within welcoming communities, it is easy to see why criticism understands the Bildungsroman as a flexible, spacious genre, since it is capacious enough to extend the hope of selfhood and social integration to even the most marginal subjects. Marianne Hirsch calls the form the most salient genre for the literature of social outsiders, primarily women or minority groups. Joseph Slaughter echoes Hirsch's claims, arguing that the Bildungsroman is not so much a coherent literary tradition as, quote, the name of a function, the generic label that good reformists repeatedly give to texts that perform a certain kind of incorporative literary social work. So, a related question, what is a domestic novel? Domestic fiction is something of a sister genre to the Bildungsroman. The marriage plot at the heart of a domestic novel presents socialization, joining with others, forming a community, as a desirable or even the highest achievement. The marriage plot insists that individuals achieve full personhood only when they relinquish a degree of personal agency and attach themselves to similar individuals in companionate marriages. Together, the Bildungsroman and the domestic novel legitimate even the most disenfranchised selves by carving out places for them in households and communities. These literary forms thus naturalize the fantasy that anyone can achieve selfhood and feel at home, provided that person is sufficiently disciplined and educated. These novels construct the ideal society one individual at a time, binding individuals to one another through the socializing mechanism of the marriage plot. Literary scholarship tends to assume that 19th century novels worked more or less like their 18th century predecessors, like Austen's novels, for example, narrating the construction of rational, reflective, perfectible selves who are capable of forming marriages and communities. Scholarship thus persuades us to overlook the radical incompatibility between established literary forms and the emergent accounts of human life, including Paley's, that seized prominence in the early 19th century. In the remaining time, I will turn to Frankenstein to analyze how Shelley appropriates these pre-industrial novelistic forms in order to show how they are no longer viable in a post-industrial world. I will conclude by thinking about what kinds of novelistic possibilities and what forms of community arise instead. Literary criticism remains largely silent about the many ways that Shelley's novel appropriates the classic Bildungsroman plotline. In keeping with the Bildungsroman tradition, Shelley constructs her story around a sensitive youth, Victor Frankenstein, who leaves his country home to study in the city. By anticipating Victor's marriage to his cousin, Elizabeth, a marriage that will ensure the household's economic and social stability, Shelley likewise promises to follow the plot lines of the domestic novels before hers. Yet her novel departs from these plot lines in one particularly notable way. The Frankenstein family is even more inclusive, even more welcoming than the communities we find in, say, Austen's fiction. This family is not an organic unit related by blood. It welcomes such individuals as Elizabeth, Victor's cousin, and Henry Clerval, a friend whom Victor regards as a brother. The Frankenstein family is thus a flexible community of individuals who find idyllic harmony together. Such hospitable families abound in Shelley's novel. Frankenstein's Creature stumbles upon the de Lacy family in the woods. The de Lacys open their doors to include Sapphy, a, quote, sweet Arabian, who arrives at the household, quote, dressed in a dark suit and covered with a thick black veil. Of course, by the end of the novel, Victor's education and development have been entirely thwarted. Tough word. His fiancée, Elizabeth, his best friend, and his younger brother have been murdered. And these cosmopolitan, hospitable, sympathetic, welcoming, inclusive families have been ripped to shreds. The question then is, what goes so horribly wrong? The problem, I argue, begins when Shelley provides the would-be Bildungsroman hero, Victor, with the wrong kind of education. Professor Waldman's lectures on contemporary natural philosophy mesmerize Frankenstein. His lectures rhapsodize upon the power of natural philosophers to, quote, penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Frankenstein's education, as Professor Waldman here describes it, encourages Frankenstein to think like Paley, or at least one of Paley's readers. That is, he learns that he has the godlike prerogative to invade the recesses and hiding places of the natural world. His education teaches him that humanity is a biological condition one enters at birth, rather than a cultural condition one achieves through a family like the one he left behind in Geneva. And finally, his education does not teach him to be an individual in the world, as he would have learned in a pre-industrial novel of development. It teaches him instead that he can tear apart and reassemble the dead bodies of animals and people and manufacture a body one piece at a time, just as a machinist would assemble a machine. Laboring under the proposition that a human is an assemblage that he can study, dismantle, and reassemble, a proposition made commonplace by natural theology, Frankenstein famously usurps the role of creator. He invades dissecting rooms and slaughterhouses, collects materials, and disturbs with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. The creature that Victor assembles embodies the contradiction that we found in natural theology. He's a machine assembled according to a set of plans, yet he possesses an individuated consciousness. In one of the novel's most famous passages, Victor describes the monster's face just as he animates his creature. His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. In this passage, Frankenstein echoes Paley's narrative mode when he catalogs and admires the monster's individual features, selected as beautiful. His gaze, like Paley's, rests upon one luxuriance at a time, from the yellow skin to the lustrous black hair to the teeth of pearly whiteness, and eventually halts at the creature's straight black lips. Victor here describes the creature just one feature at a time, rather than as a coherent being, because he is not a coherent being. Like Paley's interlocking machines, the monster is a conglomeration of beautiful parts that fit together. Unlike Paley's machines, however, the terrible whole overshadows the beauty of any single feature. The monster's skin, Victor explained, scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. This body quite literally reveals the network of machinery beneath the skin. In so doing, the monster's body insists upon the mechanical identity of all humanity, an identity that threatens the liberal fantasy that all are autonomous individuals. The sight of this body forces all who see it to own up to the single species body that all share, and transforms humanity into a single mechanical system. Under these circumstances, Victor and his monster are one being, related through the systems they share, and that the creature's body makes visible. Shelley's novel likewise breaks new ground by opening to humanity the same impulse, keeping Paley's mother bird on her nest as her body wastes away. Austen's heroines, Emma Woodhouse or Lizzie Bennet, for example, learn to control their own behavior by thinking, by reflecting on past experiences. In contrast, Shelley insists that post-industrial characters, like Victor, like his creature, cannot govern themselves because they cannot choose to which stimuli they will respond. Beginning on the night he animates his creature, Frankenstein's body requires ever more attention and eventually overrides the intellect that Frankenstein believes separated him from the species. As his pulse begins to beat so quickly and hardly that he felt the palpitation of every artery, the line separating him from any other animal or mechanical being blurs. A frantic impulse and a natural stimulus drive Frankenstein to assemble his monster, not intelligence. Under these circumstances, his capacity for self-government, essential to the novel of education, succumbs to the unpredictability of his physical sensations. The more Frankenstein overvalues the intellect as the seat of his own humanity, treating his own consciousness as separate from the machine he created, the more his body takes on a mind of its own, telling him that it depends upon the same things other forms of biological life depend upon for sustenance. Such unmediated impulse binds Frankenstein to his creature and renders him insensible to anything outside that relation. This relationship becomes a central preoccupation of the novel as Frankenstein and his creature chase one another to the ends of the earth, eventually clashing in the Arctic. Like Paley's mother bird, as Frankenstein becomes instinctually captivated to the creature he assembled, he relinquishes all claim to the autonomy that would have qualified him to learn, grow, develop, lead a household, the central tenets of traditional pre-industrial novels. Instead, he becomes little more than a pulsating thing, led not by the, quote, ardent desire of his soul, the hallmark of liberal subjectivity, but by an unself-conscious, quote, mechanical impulse that arises from the captivation to the machine that he created. Although the Frankenstein family repeatedly attempts to reclaim Victor, his impulsive connection to his creature places Victor outside the family, on the same terrain with the monster, conjoined to the biomechanical life that Shelley, for better or for worse, introduced into the novelistic tradition. When the mechanical life of the body refuses to remain an object of study, the Bildungsroman and the domestic novel cannot hold. Despite its inclusive, flexible structure, the household is still far too narrow to incorporate the kind of humanity that both Victor and his monster embody. When the monster intrudes into each household, he necessarily tears these companionate families apart. Shelley's creature shifts the basic definition of human being from culture to biology, from the individual intellectual consciousness that the 18th century believed man to be, to the biomechanical aggregate that the early 19th century knows man to be. The domestic novel was not designed to accommodate the truth that Frankenstein's creature embodies, humanity's implication in the mechanical continuity of life. The household consequently loses its symbolic power as the mechanism that props up the ideal community. Shelley offers a tentative alternative to the household in her easily overlooked narrator, Captain Walton. Walton's ambition to reach the North Pole risks the lives of his entire crew. At the end of the novel, to preserve the common life of the shipboard community, Walton turns his ship around, and in so doing, turns Paley's contradiction inside out. Walton's ship, as a shifting temporary domicile, protects, if without sentiment, the biological life of the humanity it houses. In turning his ship around, Walton subordinates his own intellect, his own ambition, to the life of the physical body he shares in common with his crew. Through Walton, Shelley thus proposes an alternate way to create human community in the mechanical age, to value the life of the body, the structures we share in common, rather than the mind alone as the seat of life itself. Shelley's novel negates the utopian promise of selfhood that pre-industrial novels promised. Despite the hospitality of the Bildungsroman and domestic novel, Shelley shows that these kinds of novels cannot contain what the human had become by the early 19th century. By so doing, Shelley bequeaths the 19th century a most inhospitable problem. When the body's competing systems challenge the mind as the seat of life, and as the human becomes a walking machine, how do human beings coexist if not in households and communities of individuals? How will 19th century fiction navigate and represent the new forms of being, thinking, and feeling that subsequently arise? I don't have time to answer these questions thoroughly today, but I will end with a proposal. Scholarship tends to assume, as I've mentioned, that 18th century accounts of humanity persisted into the 19th century. Instead, we could consider how later novels like Jane Eyre, like Great Expectations, participate in an alternative 19th century canon. These novels, I argue, take up the problem that Shelley places at the heart of Frankenstein. What happens to the novel in the 19th century when humans have become machines? Thank you.
We definitely have some time for discussion, questions. Oh, go for it.
Sure. Thank you. It's really interesting. This has always been one of my favorite novels, and so I couldn't help think as you're talking about the way that the novel is sort of really trying to explore what it means to be human in this context of the Industrial Revolution. What does it mean? How does creativity fit in? That's all also in the Myth of Prometheus that she subtitles the book, right?
Right, the modern Prometheus.
The modern Prometheus.
Yes.
So that Prometheus myth is also so much about what it means to be human. Some versions he actually creates humanity. Sometimes he's just creating what it means to be human. Yeah. But particularly thinking about the implications of his gift of fire in terms of technology in the Industrial Revolution, or the way that I think Shelley's also thinking about it in terms of what it means to what creativity, thinking of fire as being more metaphorical and kind of creativity, but also thinking about what it means to be human versus on a continuum of animal, human, machine, divine, all that sort of thing. So
thank you.
So I think that, I don't know if that's part of your thinking. It sort of seems to dovetail nicely with your readings of the
thank you.
The natural theologians. And
I hadn't actually made the overt connection to the Prometheus story, but you're convincing me that I should. Yeah.
Well, and she isn't the story you guys know this better than I do. She and her husband and Byron all got together in that house, and they also wrote Prometheus.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This question of creativity and what does it mean to be creative in the mechanical age when mass production becomes possible as artisans are losing their jobs and their work? And so Paley, just to kind of go back to the text that I do talk about, his answer is, well, the machines themselves betray artistry, that to create a machine and to master the machine in the 19th century has to become compatible with creativity. But thank you for your question. Yeah.
I thought this was really interesting, and I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to reveal myself as an early Americanist and someone who studies the late 18th century in the United States, and say or ask. So in 2002, Colleen Terrell wrote a dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania that is about the mechanistic nature of thinking in the political and novelistic realm. In the late 18th century, she says that the founding fathers are thinking in this way about bodies as machines, and she also says that the early novelists in the late 18th century, specifically Charles Brockden Brown is the part that I remember most, is also thinking about this problem of the human as machine, and how do you think about sort of like working through the problem of a mechanistic human. I noted that as you were talking, at certain points you talked about this kind of mechanical impulse that drives people forward. That's also a hallmark of Brockden Brown's novels, in which he often, for example, in Arthur Mervyn, the protagonist is always finding himself like opening doors without knowing why he's opening them. He's constantly doing things that he can't account for, because his body just kind of does them. What I'm actually kind of curious about here is that the Shelleys really famously read a lot of Brockden Brown, and Brockden Brown had read a lot of Godwin, and so there's like a lot of really tight connections between this kind of tradition in the Americas and the tradition that you're tracing in England. And so this is a kind of a metropole colonies question. I want to push a little and ask, like, is this really the beginning, or might we be able to actually say that like there's something coming out of the kind of push for originality that starts with the revolution, that actually is kind of beginning to shift the, I mean, in some sense, like your provocation was to move an argument earlier, right? And I'm asking whether we can move it even earlier to the late 18th century.
Right, and make it transatlantic.
And make it transatlantic.
Sure.
And yeah, because knowing that Mary Shelley and Percy read a ton of Charles Brockden Brown and were really familiar. And in that sense too, I guess I will also say, just to, if you haven't read Brown recently or at all, his novels are famously fractured. They're famously incomplete. Right, so even when people get married at the end, it's incredibly unsatisfying. So I'm wondering, anyway, that's a huge question and probably a little unfair as somebody who works in the late 18th century US, but I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
So my focus has been on the British novel. So no, Brockden Brown hasn't necessarily been on my, what's the word I want? I'm trying to avoid saying radar, but I'm just going to say radar. It's not been on my reading list, right? But the point that you make doesn't surprise me at all. I have read Brockden Brown. It's been a long time. The point you make doesn't surprise me for a few reasons. So first, as I was mentioning, this idea of the compatibility or incompatibility, this huge question, it's not even unique to the 18th century. It goes back so much further than that, right? So this is a huge question in the 17th century and the 18th century, Brockden Brown, Shelley, and moving forward. So yes. And then also I'm aware that in terms of novels, there wasn't this strict divide between what was being read in Britain and what was being read in the United States. There was a lot of commerce back and forth. So the point that you're making, I guess what I'd say is, it doesn't surprise me. It's not part of this project, but like the point that Carol was raising, it makes me want to connect these things. Yeah.
Does Paley, Rebecca, say that the body is like a machine, or does he say that the body is a machine?
This is really clear. He's very clear that it is. He's arguing for identity, not similarity.
So what then?
Yeah.
I guess this is a crazy question, given your answer, but what then differentiates a body from a machine?
So for him, he would say not much. with an asterisk, right? Provided that it's an animal body. He's happier to align animal bodies and machines, but when it comes down to instinct, like with the mother bird, he really can't resign humans fully to the mechanical world. And so he'll pull humans back. He will say things like human bodies are machines in every way except for they're not subject to instinct. I mean, so that's the kind of thing that we see
Does he,
in Paley.
if the group will let me just ask one
Yeah,
follow-up
sure.
question. Does he speak about in natural theology the soul? Is it because you possess a soul and Eve and Carol and I? That's what makes us different, ultimately.
Yes, yes. And that's why he can't quite just go for the big claim and say, there's no part of personality that isn't mechanical. But in the 18th century, the French materialists would make that claim, but he shies away from it.
It's interesting,
Yeah.
he uses the phrase invisible hand.
Yeah.
There's something that's very important that we can't see.
Exactly.
And our friend Mary Shelley, she used the phrase invisible world.
Right.
Again, there's something we can't see
Right.
that maybe complicates or
Yeah.
problematizes this effort to see the connection or link or identity between machines and bodies.
Yeah, thank you.
So in addition to the mechanistic age, some scholars also see both Polidori's vampire and Frankenstein like within the context of the obsession with blood in the 17th century, like the plague, blood circulation, sectarian wars, so like, loss of deaths visible in society, and at the same time the decline of witchcraft and the rise of the vampire cult. There's a really good article by the historian Gabor in the Habsburg Empire. Suddenly we see that it's like the ones who came to Salem, they brought the witchcraft, but then at the same time when Salem trials were happening in Europe, there was no issue of witchcraft. They were talking about the vampire. So they just like brought this old lore, which was already replaced by a new one in the Habsburg Empire. So definitely probably Polidori's vampire could be seen in that trajectory. But when you compare, for instance, Frankenstein and the vampire, the figure of the vampire of Polidori, like do you see any similarities, or do you think like the Polidori's vampire belongs to this like old mentality where Frankenstein kind of maybe symbolizes the Industrial Revolution to come?
So I'm definitely reading Shelley's monster as part of the Industrial Revolution, as actually very modern. Yeah, and I don't personally, I haven't done a lot of work on Polidori's vampire, but I have written about Stoker's vampire. And so we go from, I would say, both of these figures at the times in which these novels were written, Mary Shelley at the start of the century, Bram Stoker at the end of the 19th century, they're absolutely figures for modernity. At least that's how I want to read them. Yeah.
And is there blood in Frankenstein, or is like...
There's not a lot of blood.
There is?
There's not a lot.
No, right?
Isn't that interesting? And you're actually teaching me to read that. I hadn't asked myself that question. There's so much blood in Bram Stoker's novel, but there's not so much in Frankenstein.
And is it the idea in Frankenstein to revive the death, or creating a new machine out of nothing?
Create a new machine out of dead parts. And so that's why I think Paley is so useful for thinking about Shelley, because Paley is so interested in pieces, part to part to part to part, right? And I think that Shelley seizes upon that idea to create her monster. It's not animating something that's dead. It's collecting the parts. It's piecing together the machine. And I actually think that idea of parts connecting to parts connecting to parts is so important for 19th century natural histories. I'm thinking about Darwin, who started his kind of questioning with this big sort of, why does that part fit there? Why does that beak fit into this flower, right? This part to part to part connection, but not a lot of blood. Yeah, thank you.
So,
Are there other?
I was so interested in what you had to say about genre and how Frankenstein messed up a whole genre, the novel of education and of growing into oneself. Could you take this argument a bit later and, if we look at industrial novels written during industrialization, North and South, for instance, what happens to the domestic plot?
Right.
If the Bildungsroman
Right.
is kind of ruined.
Right. Well,
What
I'd
happens
say,
to the domestic plot then?
yes. I like this question a lot because I have a lot to say about it. I think that, and this is what I was hinting at with my last few questions, there are so many 19th century novels that, like Shelley, at least in part masquerade as a Bildungsroman, a novel of education, a domestic novel. But when we look closely at them, we realize that these marriages they're very skewed, right? These characters, I mean, perhaps we could say that someone like Jane Eyre develops, but I'm actually more interested in how her body, like Victor Frankenstein's, like his creatures, really misbehaves. So what looks like self-regulation, what looks like self-governance, most times in the 19th century has to do with the brain acting up, the nerves acting up, of learning how to work with the physical body that is so unruly. And so that's what I would say. There are a lot of novels, again, Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, so many others that, end in a marriage, maybe, kind of, end with a household, but the household is somewhat distorted, and I think it has to do with the unruliness of the body. Yeah.
What would you do with Wuthering Heights?
Oh, what would I do with Wuthering Heights?
And there's another monstrous.
I would
man
say,
in the center.
absolutely. So one thing that I think is really interesting that connects Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights is this problem of the monstrous. So Heathcliff, I would call Heathcliff monstrous. He doesn't have the kind of body that Shelley's monster has. But I think that Wuthering Heights, it performs the same problem that we see in Frankenstein. So if the problem in Frankenstein is that the monster tells his story, he begs for sympathy, he wants a partner, he wants a household, right? It's almost a joke in Frankenstein that someone will have compassion for him and then that household will get torn up, everyone will get killed. I mean, it's really consistently a mistake to try to sympathize with the creature because he's not the same kind of human. I think that we have the same problem in Wuthering Heights. So we have Catherine and Heathcliff, who they do partake of the same kind of humanity, right? But it's a big mistake when other characters like, is her name Olivia? Does anyone know? I feel like I should know, and I don't. The one who marries him, and he brutalizes her, right? It's the same kind of mistake in believing that the monster is worthy of sympathy, when the problem is that's actually not the same kind of human.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was really an amazing talk. And the other questions were so great, I forgot my own question. So I was wondering, this whole moment also corresponds to the founding moment of sociology as a discipline.
Oh, interesting.
And the emergence of a mechanical society or visioning the society as an organism, these are the founding narratives of sociology. But there's also the counterpart of these narratives, the rise of the emergence and making of a working class and working class reactions to this mechanical society and all the things that it brings. So I was wondering, can you read or do you see traces of these reactions, like sabotaging the machines? Like, are they maybe visible? Can they be seen in how erratic the creature reacts to impulses without, are they diminishing those, maybe organized,
Absolutely.
or emerging, sabotaging or other things into those erratic moments?
Yes. So a couple things come to mind in response to your question. So I read Paley as almost the opposite of that, of trying to kind of bolster up the machines and gloss over, right, the loss that industrialization poses, right? So we have these kinds of texts in the 19th century. So yes, you're reading, I think, of the monster and his rage. That makes sense to me. And then the other thing that comes to mind, in Shelley, I don't know if you know the novel Shelley by Charlotte Bronte, who also wrote Jane Eyre. The riots in the machine, kind of the burning of machines, it figures in that novel itself, alongside this kind of fractured or distorted, I would call it a distorted kind of marriage plot as well. So it's certainly there. Thank you.
Students, any questions? No? No, not putting you on the spot at all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.